Hello, my dear viewers. I'm glad to be with you. I'm Olga Demchuk, a researcher of the inner world of personality. My peers remember the show Good Night, Little Ones. Well, today we have Wake Up Grown-ups, or perhaps you'll come up with a different name. Today we have two cats and a cube called Also a Cat. Today we are going to discuss something interesting. We will talk about relationships between people, about the dynamic of us and them. When we come into this world, we perceive it as unfamiliar. That is, when a baby emerges from the womb, it looks as if it has just been awakened. I think we all have the same expression on our faces in the morning. We are like infants torn from the womb, from sleep, into this unpredictable and not very kind world. Everything around is unfamiliar, strange sounds and some vague silhouettes, because an infant can hardly even see these people. They are not used to looking at external objects. Their eyes were closed inside the womb. And gradually, out of this kind of twilight, these objects gradually begin to take shape. And some of these objects, which actually are subjects, are still perceived by the child only as inanimate objects. At the earliest stage of development, they become familiar because they are always nearby and they care for the child. For better or worse, no infant would survive if they were not cared for. And this is how the familiar ones appear. But our initial perception of everything new as something foreign has remained with us to this day. Both in children and adults, when something new appears, it is quite difficult for us to perceive it as something interesting. At first, it is foreign and dangerous. And little children, when they see a stranger, an unfamiliar man or woman, they get scared. In other words, our internal alarm system, it initially perceives everything that appears in our field of vision as foreign, and only what we recognize becomes familiar to us. And these two wonderful cats, who have already appeared in several videos for you, will serve as symbols. The black cat represents the foreign, and the white cat represents the familiar. This is a stranger, and this is someone familiar. And as you may have already noticed, we have a cube that isn't even a cat, but it says cat on it. This is a real person who is neither familiar nor foreign, but simply exists on their own. So who are the familiar ones? At the initial stage, the familiar ones are those who satisfy our needs. Someone who fulfills my needs. Someone who peels oranges or tangerines for me on New Year's. And this is not some kind of derogatory or negative word. A satisfier is someone who relieves me from pain. That is, a child perceives a desire that arises within them as something that attacks their psyche. And it's the same for adults. When we feel hungry, thirsty, or sleepy, our psyche perceives it as something attacking us, as something intrusive. They subjugate and enslave us, forcing us into certain actions. In other words, our desires are our own. To some extent, they are our slave masters. And the specific person in our immediate environment, who graciously relieves me from the constant attack of my own pressing needs, is naturally perceived as a true savior. We carry this thought, or is it this perception we bring with us? Then, for many years, we designate someone else as a savior who has come to free us from certain problems. Some parents consider those who ask for their daughter's hand in marriage to be saviors, especially when the parents are eager to let her go as soon as possible. Some parents even get down on their knees and thank the daughter-in-law, saying, "At last, someone has been found who can put up with him." These are the kinds of saviors we encounter in our lives. Saviors are those who helped us out with a spare tire on the road. Saviors are those who let us go ahead in line when it was necessary. So as you can see, this helper, this savior, is not necessarily a negative figure. But what interests us is the distinction between our own and outsiders, not just from one perspective. It's not just about we got to know each other better and he became one of us, but more about the nature of relationships. Because the same person, like this cube cat, can be both one of our own and an outsider. When we join a group, at first everyone is a stranger, and those who are closer to us become our own. This could be based on the way they dress, the way they speak, or other criteria. And we start to fear these our own less, even if we don't consciously realize it. That is, when it comes to those we have designated as our own, our internal alarm doesn't ring as loudly. And as a result, we feel less fear toward them. Consequently, we also feel less anger, or perhaps we tolerate them less. Let's go over this once more. So our own are those toward whom we feel less fear. Accordingly, we are less likely to perceive their actions as an attack, and we have to tolerate them less. Or we have to suppress our desire to defend ourselves less often. And the people who are around us, we will, in a sense, divide them into those who satisfy our needs and those who do not. So those of our own who are interesting to us for some reason, perhaps the person holds a certain position, or you've heard something intriguing about them, or they might be able to solve a problem for you. This category will be the white cats, while everyone else will be the black cats. Our own are those from whom we need something. Don't take needing something as something negative. It's normal for adults to need something from each other. And when we come into the view of those we've designated as our own, we also want to become one of their own. So the ideal scenario is one of our own on both sides. When I see you as one of my own, as a white cat, I want to be closer to you. And you see me as one of your own, as a white cat, a nice cat you wouldn't mind being closer to. And then a connection happens in which some kind of communication takes place. But later, for example, when we get rejected by the person we needed something from, we move them into the category of outsider, not one of our own. After all, they're bad. Even though this person, just like before, remains that same green cat cube, meaning they are still themselves. So the distinction between one of us and an outsider is entirely our own perception, but we rarely see it as something personal to us. We tend to project it onto the entire fate of that person. This person becomes completely bad or wrong, an outsider, even repulsive. And from an outsider, of course, we want to keep our distance from someone repulsive. In other words, perceiving another person as they truly are. We are capable of this, but it requires effort on our part. Ideally, we would like everyone to be one of us. People have this experience. They go through it, for example, when they're in a good mood, and then everyone seems beautiful or kind or like one of their own. No, this sense of alienation, of perceiving others as foreign and dangerous, and the other person is vitally important to us. Right now, I am preparing for the School of Relationships, which will begin on December 6th. And as you can see, I am already developing material that I am gradually starting to share with you. I am particularly interested in the concept of one's own and the other, specifically in the context of close relationships, of close people. So we have just discussed, in general, how we perceive others as either our own or as outsiders. Now let's talk about close relationships. Close people are vitally important to us, if only because we have a dominant instinct from infancy, where we clearly understood that we could not survive without those close to us. In other words, close ones are those thanks to whom I will not die. An infant, if no one needs them, will die. And so this dominant instinct that exists within us is always pulsing, and it will be triggered regardless of our will. So this sense of helplessness, when I feel that no one needs me, comes to us from the past. And many people seeking relationships do not realize that what they are really after is the chance to free themselves from the anxiety that is generated from within, from the distant past. And when this other person appears, initially with a neutral status, neither familiar nor a stranger, then if a person designates this other as a provider, either current or potential, they begin to perceive them as their own. This is necessary for them in order to overcome their own internal alarm system. In other words, a gradual idealization of this person begins. And being in love is the maximum idealization of the other. When he becomes truly yours, deeply familiar, the very best, the most wonderful. So this idealization is necessary for us in order to silence the inner beast. Many people idealize strange individuals, for example, their rulers, who are quite tyrannical. In other words, a tyrant can be idealized precisely so that one does not have to experience all those feelings toward them. That is, to idealize, to designate them as one of your own. It's much easier this way. A person is relieved of a great number of problems. So we all have someone close to us, a spouse, a friend, a boyfriend, or a girlfriend. That is, choose an example, and this person is, in essence, just themselves. But for us, they sometimes appear whiter, sometimes blacker, and so our loved one seems to darken in our eyes. For example, you come to your boyfriend, husband, wife, and so on and so forth, and you say, we've been invited to visit someone, I want to go with you. It will be on Wednesday. And your partner says, I don't want to go. And at that moment, our partner, who in our perception was white, meaning when we approached them and said, let's go visit, we've been invited, I am addressing them as someone white, as someone close to me. But as soon as they say, no, I don't want to, they immediately become black. That is, the white cat starts to turn gray until it becomes black. Blackness, a black cat, because he doesn't want to be my satisfier, he doesn't want to do things the way I want. And at that moment, a sense of alienation appears within me. In other words, I estrange him from myself. He is no longer one of my own. He moves from the space of mine to the space of other. An enemy, he becomes an enemy. In other words, in our perception, the ultimate outsider is the enemy. And his blackness, it is perceived by us as something that begins to activate our alarm system. That is, we now perceive him with the alarm system switched on, which had previously been off. I think each of you has had moments when you considered someone your own, but then they did or said something, and you felt your attitude change. That is, they moved from the category of white to black, and immediately the dormant alarm system begins to react to them as to an outsider. But let's return to our example. Let's say it's my husband to whom I said that we're going to visit someone. He says, I don't want to. And from my reaction, he understands, or maybe he doesn't fully understand, but he definitely feels that alienation has begun. It's as if I started to distance myself from him because he didn't do what I wanted. This is that very alienation, that distancing. And unconsciously, he might not even realize it. He says, well, it's not that I don't want to go, and by no means do I not want to go with you, but I'm just so tired from work. And on Wednesday, we have a long meeting. I don't know when I'll be free, and even if I am, I'll be completely exhausted. And the black husband starts to turn gray, and he's no longer black but gray because he gave in, and he explained himself, but not quite enough yet. White. And then he says, well, darling, I see that you're upset, but in reality, I was the one who got a little upset. He says, let me do something nice. Let me put up those shelves you've been asking for. And that's it. He's turned white. He's back to being himself again. And this process of turning white or black is not perceived by us as something we ourselves create. It seems to us that this cat, all on its own, becomes either a white cat or a black cat, even though it actually stays exactly the same. And many people cannot withstand this sense of alienation. I think each of you has experienced the punishment of alienation. When someone close to you stops speaking to you, they no longer needed anything from you. They stopped sharing with you. In other words, they treated you as if you were either invisible or a stranger, just some passerby, an unfamiliar person living in the same space. And at that moment, our dominant emotion is triggered. It starts spinning with anxiety, just like the flashing lights on an ambulance. Anxiety, anxiety, anxiety. And the more a person's dominant belief is charged with the idea of I am not needed by anyone, therefore I will die, the deeper they begin to sink into oblivion and they start pushing themselves further in order to fix the situation and not feel this inner anxiety that has arisen within them. And I would like this to be brought into awareness, because many people, that is precisely why they do not set boundaries, because they cannot withstand the alienation from themselves. And another important point I would like to highlight in this video is the maintenance of artificial alienation. For example, this is clearly seen in teenagers. A teenager who idealizes their parents sees them as absolutely perfect, like white cats. At some point, they turn these parents into black for years. In other words, the teenager starts to contradict, confront, disagree. They have their own perspective, an opinion that is distinctly different from that of their parents. In this way, they maintain an artificial sense of alienation. So what we have here is a kind of layered situation. Our parents are excessively idealized, and we are very afraid that they will reject us, alienate us, and then we will not survive. And onto this idealization, we layer an equal amount of demonization. So this is the kind of composition we end up with. That is, my hatred must be strong enough to compensate for this attachment. And I think each of you has experienced a moment when someone you once idealized later becomes demonized by you yourself. In other words, it's as if you constantly have to pile on hatred equal in volume to the idealization you feel toward that person, sometimes even a bit more, just so you don't believe again, don't forgive again, don't fall back into submission, and so on. And if you don't sort out this sense of my own, my dear, my ideal, and so forth, you end up having to do this constantly, to artificially create someone, to hate them in your mind, just so you don't fall through the ice again, don't slip back into submission. So the only way to get out of hatred is to perceive that person as just a cat, as someone who simply exists on their own. That is, as soon as the component of this is me gets mixed in, it's all over. And I would like you to pay attention to how your loved ones change their color from black to white and from white to black. That is, notice how they fade from gray to black, or how black fades to white. And observe how we play all of this out within ourselves. Punishment by alienation. I would like this to become the focus of your attention, because due to alienation, we sometimes cannot build healthy relationships with other people. Well, I'll wrap up here. I'll talk about this in more detail at the School of Relationships, about strangers and our own. And I'd like to ask you to write in the comments, if you've already understood the meaning of this video, how your loved ones have changed their colors. Sometimes white, sometimes gray, sometimes black. And perhaps some of you have experienced bringing them out of being seen as purely white or black and into being a subject who exists independently without us. Please like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and with that, I'll say goodbye for now. Until next time.